Hey everyone, Bill Lethman here for Money Evolution. In this video, I'm going to be talking about how to create your retirement withdrawal plan. So if you're somebody that's planning for retirement, this may be one of the single most important things you can do to help you prepare better for your retirement. So in this video, I'm going to be walking you through the exact 6-step process that we use all the time with our comprehensive financial planning clients. But real quick though, before I get into the content of today's video, if you want to learn a little bit more about what we do at Money Evolution and our comprehensive financial planning, we've got some links down in the description below, or you can go to wealthvisionplan.com to learn a little bit more about our comprehensive financial plan. Okay, so the first step in almost all financial planning or retirement planning is to really understand what your needs are. Now, I know a lot of people may not necessarily like the idea of having a budget or having to stick to something very regimented, but I think as you go into retirement, this is going to be a very good exercise for almost everybody to do. Because after all, you're going to be shifting from getting that regular paycheck on a consistent basis to cover all of your living expenses to now maybe having to rely a lot more on some of your investment assets to provide for those everyday living expenses. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of dissect a budget. I've talked about it many times here on the YouTube channel, a million different ways, but what I like to do is separate your expenses into two different categories. One is going to be what we call your committed expenses. So the everyday things, it could be food, groceries, property taxes, insurance, utility bills, car payments, car expenses, things like that, versus uncommitted expenses. And those are going to be things like maybe travel, hobbies, and recreation, things that can be a little bit more flexible from one year to the next. So as we get into some of the details of how this is all going to break down, some years maybe if the market's not doing as well, maybe some of those uncommitted expenses may be an area that you can cut back on a little bit. So for purposes of this, we're just going to assume a couple of things. Let's say that your committed expenses are $100,000 for the year, and we'll say that you have uncommitted expenses, maybe that's your travel budget, of $20,000 per year. Now, one of the things that we know too, and this isn't going to be a deep dive into taxes, but we're going to assume that you have some taxes here as well. So this is going to mean basically that you need, if you include those uncommitted expenses, basically $10,000 a month. But if we assume, for example, that you're in a 20% effective tax rate, let's say that's combined federal and state, just to keep the math here relatively simple, we could basically divide that by 0.8, and we got that by basically subtracting 1 minus our effective tax rate, so 1 minus 0.2 means we're going to divide that by 0.8, and that means that we need to net, in this situation here, $150,000 per year to cover both those committed and uncommitted expenses. Now, if you're doing this and then you determine that maybe there's not enough of those investment assets to cover some of those uncommitted expenses, or maybe even some of the committed expenses, maybe one of those committed expenses is a really expensive car payment. Those are things that, yes, you do have a commitment to that today, but you could always change that. You could, maybe scale that back a little bit in some circumstances. Some people may have some housing expenses and may decide as they go into retirement to maybe downsize their home, and that kind of releases a little bit of some of those committed expenses. But for right now, we're going to assume that you need $150,000, and that's going to include the taxes on that amount of income. Okay, so once we kind of understand what some of those needs are, the next thing we want to do is we want to look at what are some of the resources that we have. And the first thing we're going to look at for resources is we're going to look at what's called predictable sources of income. And I think for most people probably watching this video, one of those predictable sources of income is going to be Social Security. That might be for you, and also if you're married, for your spouse as well. So you might have some Social Security income. A lot of people have pensions. I wish more people had pensions, but pensions could be another source of that predictable income there. Other things that may be available here, if you have an annuity and maybe that annuity is paying some lifetime income or withdrawal benefit, that may be another source of predictable income. If you, let's say, participated in a deferred compensation program through work. Maybe you had some money set aside while you're working that reduced your taxes while you were employed, and then maybe that's going to pay out over some period of time in retirement. Maybe it's going to pay out in a lump sum rate when you retire. Maybe it's going to pay out a little bit over 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. A lot of different options there. Different companies have different rules and things that you can do. If you have some, let's say, rental income, could be another source of predictable income. So rental income. Maybe you sold a business or a piece of property on a land contract and you have some regular income there. Could be from a lot of different sources, but basically these are things that are virtually, let's say, guaranteed, or money that's going to be very predictable coming out here on a regular basis, and you know what those are. They're not going to be something that you're withdrawing from a portion of your retirement accounts to cover that. So let's start adding some details to this. I always like to begin by looking at what things are going to look like at your full retirement age. Now, there's a whole other conversation that goes into whether to take Social Security at your full retirement age, delay it to age 70, or take it as early as age 62. But I think for most people, 67 is probably going to be a pretty good rule of thumb as far as a good collection age there. But again, when we get into some of our comprehensive financial planning, we get into a lot of detail where we can really isolate and pinpoint when some of those break-even points are and everything. So let's assume that combined, let's say you're married and you're going to have a combined Social Security benefit of $70,000 per year. And let's also assume, we're going to try to keep our math reasonably simple here, that you have $20,000 coming in from a pension. Now, one thing is that the pension, that may start at 67, but your pension may actually start, if you wanted to, I'm just going to slide that over, at age 65. So you can kind of see how some of this income could change a little bit from year to year. Basically, at your full retirement age, by the time you're getting that Social Security benefit, you're going to have $90,000 coming in from predictable income sources. So again, one of the reasons why I like to look at those committed and uncommitted expenses is we can see that for this individual, or for this hypothetical situation here, they had committed expenses of $100,000 per year, and with $90,000 coming in from a pension and a Social Security benefit, you're covering 90% of those committed expenses there. So that's very nice. That kind of helps a lot of people get a little bit more peace of mind to know that they have most of their everyday living expenses covered. And then you could start maybe looking at different investments that may pay some dividends or some interest that could fill in that gap, so that you can kind of sleep well at night knowing that you have at least those committed expenses covered there. Okay, so for this example, most of those committed expenses are going to be covered just from those predictable sources of income. So $90,000 out of our projected $100,000 of committed expenses. But in an ideal situation, obviously we want to be able to get all the way up to the $150,000, which is going to include taxes, and it's also going to include some of those extra things too, the fun things that we want to do in retirement, like travel and hobbies and recreation and everything. So if we take that $90,000, which is our predictable income sources, and we subtract that from $150,000, it means we have a gap of $60,000. And this is our gap at our full retirement age. And I always like to begin there because even if we want to retire early, we want to see what is the long-term projections for money coming in and money going out once things sort of stabilize. And age 67 is typically that point where things do tend to stabilize a little bit. So $60,000. So that's going to be, without factoring in inflation and things like that, the amount that we're going to need to withdraw from the portfolio assets over time. And so with that, one of the things we want to do is we want to see, is that going to be sustainable with how much we have in investment assets? So one of the things we use oftentimes is something called the 4% rule. Basically, that says that if we limit our withdrawals to 4% of our portfolio value each year, we should have a good chance that that money is going to last us throughout our retirement. So we can sort of work that math backwards and basically divide our cash flow needs, $60,000, by 0.04. And what that tells us is that we need to have a portfolio of at least $1,500,000 at our full retirement age in order to sustain that $60,000 for the rest of our lifetime there. Now, one of the things, 4%, is for some people, myself included, maybe a little bit too aggressive. So if we want to be a little bit more conservative with that, we could use 3% or even 2%, like some people have advocated for. There's been a lot of research and a lot of studies that have been done that maybe suggest that 4% may be actually a little bit too high. But we'll go with that because it's just a nice simple one, and most people are kind of familiar with that 4% rule. So that tells us, again, we need to have about $1.5 million to be able to sustain that $60,000 cash flow need throughout our lifetime, beginning at our full retirement age. Okay, but what if we wanted to retire earlier than our full retirement age at 67? So let's continue on with our example here. Let's say you want to retire at age 62 instead of age 67. So what that means is that we're going to have a 5-year window here where we're going to have less money coming in. This is, again, assuming we wait till age 67 to begin collecting our Social Security benefits. Now, that is an option, of course, to take Social Security benefits as early as age 62, but it's going to be at about a 30% reduction versus what it would be at our full retirement age. So what that would mean is instead of getting $90,000 in predictable income, you'd have something considerably less than that, which also means that instead of only needing $1.5 million at your full retirement age, you're going to need something greater than that because of the extra cash flow gap that you're going to have by taking that Social Security reduction there. So lots of things there, but we're going to assume that you continue to keep your Social Security benefits coming out at your full retirement age at 67, and now we have a 5-year window here. So we said earlier that you would be getting a $20,000 pension, and just to keep things pretty simple here, let's say you're eligible for that pension right away at age 62. So basically, instead of needing, we'll say, our $150,000, now we need $130,000 to support basically 1 year of retirement because the only predictable income that we have coming in at this point is that $20,000 pension here. So what we usually do, and the way I map this out, is we think about retirement in kind of multiple phases. So one of those, again, is how much do we need at our full retirement age, and we talked about that using the 4% rule. We need $1.5 million at that point, but then to fund our early retirement, we need $130,000 per year. We'll just do this math very simply, times 5 years. Did that calculation here. That's $650,000 that you would need to fund those first 5 years. So if you're thinking about retiring at 62, needing $1.5 million at your full retirement age and an extra $650,000 to fund those first 5 years of retirement, that means you're going to need $2,150,000 to fund that retirement. So that's sort of the math behind it, to kind of really understand, what your gaps are, kind of segmenting your retirement into a couple of different phases there really can kind of give you some ideas of, what the requirements are going to be for how much you have to have in the portfolio and how much buffer you have. So if you have a portfolio that's, let's say, $3 million, well, there's quite a bit of cushion there. There might even be some excess there. You could start looking at potentially increasing spending, for example. Maybe you say, hey, if I retire early, since I've got that extra money there, maybe we can take some extra vacations, extra trips there for maybe a portion of the retirement, maybe in those early years. Another thing to think about here too, we talked about maybe some of the predictable income that may not be there early. You also may have some extra expenses potentially as well. So you could have, for example, healthcare would be a big one. And so, as you probably know, you become Medicare eligible at age 65, where maybe some of those healthcare costs would go down versus what they would be if you retired earlier than 65 and had to go out into the exchanges for healthcare insurance. You could end up paying more money, so that could make your gap maybe go up a little bit. Some people may still have some kids at the house, and that's something that could make some of those expenses up a little bit higher. So one of the things we do, as we're doing our comprehensive financial planning, we've got some great worksheets that we have inside of our Retirement Time Machine course, but really kind of map this out year by year. So you may say that, hey, I'm going to retire at 62. I feel like I'm in pretty good shape, but I'm still paying for some kids' expenses for a period of time, maybe to 63 or 64. And so what are those expenses? Maybe that's an extra $10,000 a year. Maybe you're helping them with some college expenses, or helping them get started with something, or they're in sports or activities that are still costing some money. So you could start to kind of really fine-tune this and really see not only what some of the expenses are, also what some of those predictable income sources are as well, so you can see, what those gaps are. And again, thinking about that in terms of what's it going to be before full retirement age, what's it going to be after full retirement age. Okay, now step 4 is going to be to start to map out your assets by tax type. This is something I've talked about in other videos. In fact, I think I've made entire videos just about this topic alone. So there are 3 main categories for different buckets that you can have your financial assets in. First one is going to be called your non-retirement account assets, or something we call them taxable assets. That's going to be regular brokerage accounts, could be bank accounts, CDs, money markets, anything that's outside of a traditional or Roth IRA or 401k plan, some type of a retirement account. The second one is going to be traditional retirement accounts, so that could be traditional 401k plans, traditional IRAs. Big distinction there is going to be that as money comes out of those traditional retirement accounts, it's going to be taxed as ordinary income. So that's going to be a very important distinction there. And then also too, you could have some Roth money. So that's money that typically went in on an after-tax basis, could be Roth 401k, Roth IRA accounts, and that is going to be tax-free as long as it's considered a qualified distribution from that account. So those are the 3 buckets, and as you start to kind of plan out retirement, plan out this withdrawal strategy, you want to know how much money is in each of those different categories. Okay, so let's go ahead and put in some hypothetical values here for each of our 3 different tax categories. Let's assume that we have $300,000 in non-retirement accounts or taxable investments. Let's say we have $2 million in traditional retirement accounts. And I think that's pretty typical of a lot of the financial planning clients that we see, where most of their money tends to be in that traditional bucket. Let's assume also, though, that they have a pretty good amount in Roth as well. Maybe they've done some Roth conversions in there. Maybe they've contributed to a Roth 401k plan, for example, but they actually have a pretty good balance there. Obviously, those assets total $2,900,000. And I think that's very important too, because if we're comparing that to what we looked at just a couple minutes ago, is we needed, I think, $2,150,000 in total assets to fund not only the portion of retirement from full retirement through the rest of their lifetime, but also to fund, in this example here, that first 5 years of retirement from age 62 to 65. So $2,900,000 gives them a pretty good cushion there for being able to meet those retirement planning goals. Okay, so now step 5 is going to be to start to do a little bit of tax planning here. And there's going to be 2 things that we want to look at in particular here as we develop this tax plan. One is going to be, what is our tax bracket going to look like right now as we start to withdraw money from these 3 different tax categories, as we start to pull that money back out. And then 2, what is it going to look like down the road? In particular, what's it going to look like once those required minimum distributions kick in at 73 or 75 or whatever age that happens to be. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to continue to build out our map, and we're going to get into a little bit more detail here. And again, this is something that we do with our comprehensive financial plans. It's something that we do with our Retirement Time Machine course, where we've got some great worksheets where we help to really map this out. But basically, we have 5 years, assuming we're still going to retire at age 62. What is that going to look like? Well, we have some unique tax characteristics of those 3 different buckets. So one is we can very simply just start taking some money from this non-retirement account bucket. If that money's in cash, there really isn't going to be a taxable event that's going to take place there. We're just pulling basically our own money back out. There wouldn't really be any taxes due on that. That money could be invested in something. So you could have that in some mutual funds and some stocks, or some things that would have to be sold first before it would become liquid. And in that case, we could have a capital gain issue. That could be long-term capital gains, or it could be short-term capital gains. The distinction there is it's long-term if it's held for 12 months or longer. It's short-term if it's an asset that you've only had for something less than 12 months. And the tax distinction is going to be short-term capital gains get taxed at your income tax base rate, whatever your marginal tax rate is, and long-term capital gains get taxed at a preference rate. Typically for most people, that's going to be 15%. So let's assume for purposes of this example, let's say that $300,000 is 100% in cash. And we're going to talk about this in step 6 and how to create this cash flow buffer. That's going to be actually one of the recommendations, is that we have enough cash to get us through at least a couple of years of cash flow needs. So we're going to assume that we've done that. We've got the $300,000 in cash. And then we said earlier that we have a $20,000 pension that's going to kick in, and that's going to stay in effect for our entire lifetime, but it's going to begin at age 62. So if we have our cash flow need of $150,000, that means that we need $130,000 from our portfolio assets. Now, very simply, one of the things we could do is just say, hey, we're going to take $130,000 from our cash, and that's going to give us $130,000 in year 1. It's going to give us $130,000 in year 2, basically getting to that 150. And then in year 3, we're going to have a little bit more of a shortfall. So we're not going to have another $130,000, but we're going to have $40,000. And then we're going to have to make up some difference there. That's going to be then needing to come out of one of these other buckets. Most likely it's going to come out of the traditional retirement account bucket. So that's going to be an additional $90,000. And so we can start to map this out. And what does that look like? Well, if we're just taking back our own money, effectively, we'd be in a 0% tax bracket in each of these first 2 years of retirement, because the only taxable income that we're really going to have is going to be this $20,000 that's coming in from our pension. Now, in year 3, we're going to have $20,000 from our pension and then $90,000 from our IRA accounts. We'd have $110,000 of taxable income. If we look at our tax chart right here for 2023, we could see, for example, the 12% tax bracket, that came out really big, goes up to $117,150. So we basically would still have $7,150 left in just that 12% tax bracket. So we'd be still, even then, in a very low tax bracket. If we go back to and again, those tax brackets are going to change a little bit. They go up every year with inflation a little bit there. And then in year 4, if we had to take all $130,000 out of our retirement accounts, that's going to be pushing us up into the $150,000 tax bracket. And again, this may be a couple years down the road. Our current tax rates, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act rates, are set to expire at the end of 2025. So we may hit those levels. We're going to look at another chart here in a second. But that means that at $130,000, we'd be in basically the 22% tax bracket if that still fell within our Tax Cuts and Jobs Act rates. So that strategy is not necessarily going to be the one that's going to make the most sense, because if we're just taking money out of our non-retirement account assets, that's going to be effectively keeping us in a very low tax bracket, especially in years 1 and 2, where you're effectively in a 0% tax bracket. And then even year 3, still maybe, depending on whether those Tax Cuts and Jobs Act rates expire or not, maybe just a 12 or a 15% tax bracket. So that's going to leave a lot of opportunity on the table, and in particular, a lot of opportunity for potentially some Roth conversions. So if we were to kind of look at that money that we have in that traditional retirement account bucket, we say $2 million, and let's say that was earning a 6% rate of return. I mean, you might be getting higher or lower than that, but that means that that account's going to grow by about $120,000 per year. So, in years 1 and 2, where you're not taking any money out of that account, that's going to mean that that's going to be another $240,000. So $2,240,000 could be the balance in your retirement account. Now, in year 3, we are going to be taking some money out, $90,000, and if that account's still growing, maybe there's some compounding going on, that account's still likely going to be growing a little bit. Even when we get to years 4 and 5, if we need $130,000, it's going to be at least sort of maintaining itself, throughout this retirement there. And then even at full retirement age, let's see what we had back there when we were taking money out of the account there. We had $70,000 coming in from Social Security. We had $20,000 coming in from a pension. So that's $90,000 if we needed $50,000. So we're taking maybe, I guess it was $60,000 out at that point. So $60,000. And again, if that $2,240,000 hypothetically, if that's still continuing to get 6%, it's still maybe growing at $120,000, $130,000 per year. Even after we take that $60,000 withdrawal, we're still likely going to see that trajectory of that traditional retirement account grow to something bigger. Maybe it grows to $2,300,000 or 2.4, whatever that happens to be. And then at that point, let's say at age 73, if that's your RMD age, you're going to have to start taking some distributions out. Simple rule of thumb, it's going to be a little bit less than that, but there's going to be actually a divisor that's going to come into play there. But it's going to be basically, let's say, about 4%. So you could be taking $80,000, $90,000 out. We'll just keep it there. $80,000 could be the amount of your RMD at your 73, when you're required to start taking those distributions from those retirement accounts. So now we can kind of add all this together and say, okay, we got $80,000 maybe potentially coming in from an RMD. Again, we're just being super simple here with our math, not getting into any real specifics there. But we have we had that pension for $20,000, and we said $70,000 from Social Security benefits. So that brings us up to basically $170,000 of income. Now, again, we might have some extra factors that are going to come into play there. So Social Security tends to have a cost of living adjustment every year, so that $70,000 might be a little bit higher. But this should give us a pretty good rule of thumb that if we have $170,000 of income, and we can go out here and we can say, okay, this is 2023. We had 5 years of basically until we got to our full retirement age, so that brings us to 2028, and then another, let's say 6 years there, so we'll do 2034 if we target that, and we say, okay, where would these potential tax brackets be? So this is a chart that I created. I've showed it in some other videos. It's actually from our Retirement Time Machine course. But basically, it's to give us an idea of what our future tax brackets might be, assuming we revert back in 2026 to the pre-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act rates. And then I did put a little bit of an inflation factor in there, 2.44%. So in 2034, to kind of give us an idea, the 15% tax bracket, it's really hard to see that. Maybe I can make that a little bit bigger. The 15% tax bracket goes up to $114,000. The next tax bracket, which would be 25%, goes up to $230,000. So at $170,000 of income, we're going to be pretty squarely in the middle of that. I don't think it's probably going to be too likely for this hypothetical case study to see that income go below $114,000, depending on growth of the market and how much they're taking in withdrawals. Could be that $170,000, could exceed, go over the $230,000 in some situations. But basically, we're right here. So we're basically in a 25% tax bracket as far as where we're going to be long term. So we can go back here and then look at where we are today and clean that board up a little bit here. And we can say, okay, with the current Tax Cuts and Jobs Act rates, we can go up to $218,000 and still be in just the 22% bracket. We can go all the way up to $391,000 and be in a 24% tax bracket. So if you remember from some of my other videos, when we talk about Roth conversions and if that makes sense, typically we're going to say if our tax bracket in the future is higher than what it is today, then it's going to make sense to do those Roth conversions. If our tax bracket in the future is lower, then it doesn't make sense. So either way, if we're looking at basically future tax rate at 25%, then it may make sense for this individual to do some Roth conversions to 22%. Maybe it makes sense to go up to 24%, but I don't think in this particular situation we probably need to get quite that aggressive, but definitely going up to that $218,450 is something that I think might make some sense. Okay, so here's what that looks like. Okay, so again, we're going to be targeting that 22% tax bracket for this example, which is going to give us $218,000 of total income. And just to show you exactly what we did here, this is another one of our reference pieces here from the Retirement Time Machine course. The actual taxable income that we have for the year is $190,750. That's the upper end of the 22% tax bracket. But what we did here is we just added in the standard deduction of $27,700 to get us to that $218,000. So if you're really paying attention, you might have noticed that. But again, it's that standard deduction too that gives us a little bit more of a buffer for hitting and keeping inside that 22% tax bracket there. So $218,000 is what we're targeting there. We also know too from this that that's going to give us a 14.9% effective tax rate. So the total tax there is $32,580. So we can start to dial this in a little bit more precisely here. So $32,580, and we'll put that on there. And we know that our actual cost of living, when we added in those committed and also the uncommitted expenses, was $120,000 for the year. And so that gives us to $152,580. So basically what that's going to mean is that we're going to end up running out of money somewhere near the end of year 2. In fact, actually, if we want to be really super specific there, it's going to fall short by about $5,000 there on that. And what we've effectively done is, again, we're targeting that $218,000 22% tax bracket. And if we subtract out the $20,000 from that, so $218,000 minus $20,000, and the reason we're doing that is because that $20,000 in this example represents our only other source of taxable income, and that's going to be that pension. And so if we subtract that, basically that leaves us a difference of $198,000, and that is the amount that we are going to be able to do a Roth conversion. So you can see how that's really giving us a very nice supercharging effect to move money from that traditional bucket over to Roth. And again, in this example, we should be able to do this for 2 years. So again, we just have a couple of years left of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act rates. So this is 2023. We have this year, 2024, and then 2025. If all things kind of stay the status quo, they're going to expire at the end of 2025. So we have 3 years left. And that's going to give us a really nice opportunity, basically about $400,000, roughly just a little bit under in those Roth conversions there by just doing this for 2 years in retirement. Now that's going to bring down some future taxes a little bit there. I don't think it's probably going to be enough to get us down into the next tax bracket there from basically 25% to 15%, but still it's going to have some positive impact. And we've talked about in other videos some of the other positives of doing Roth conversions. Again, these are just what we're maybe going to see if we revert back to the pre-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act rates. But there's possibility that we see a major increase in taxes to try to pay for some of this government spending that's been going on for the last, last decades, I guess is the way we would phrase that. But yeah, so if tax rates in the future go up, that's going to be something that could make all of this stuff even more positively impactful for doing some of these Roth conversions. Okay, so now the sixth and the final step in this creating your retirement withdrawal plan is going to be to create a cash flow buffer. Now this is something we've talked about in a lot of other videos, but basically I believe in having 3 separate buckets of where you're going to kind of position your assets. And now this is different than the 3 buckets we were talking about earlier with the non-retirement, the traditional retirement, and the Roth. But basically in bucket number 1 is we want to have basically some cash, maybe some money markets, basically some safer types of investments and things like that. And typically we want to see at least 1 to 2 years of cash flow needs. Now, when we just modeled in those Roth conversions, we now know that our cash flow needs are going to be about $152,000 per year. So that $300,000 that we have in that non-retirement account kind of fits into that pretty perfectly there. So we like to start off generally with the 2 years. And then basically what that's going to allow us to hopefully have happen is if we see some volatility in the financial markets and we see our stock or equity type of investments going down in value, that can allow us to kind of let those recover a little bit without having to sell investments that may be down in value. So that's going to be very important to have that cash flow buffer there for bucket number one. And then bucket number two generally is going to be another 3 to 5 years. Now that could be something that I think still should be very safe, so we should have that money in things that are going to have more protection, so CDs or treasuries, things like that. Bonds can kind of fit into that category a little bit too, but bonds can go up and down in value as well, so you have to be very careful of that. In fact, actually 2022 with interest rates going up was one of the worst years ever on record for bond performance because those interest rates were going up. So bonds are not necessarily always safe, but generally we want to have things that are going to be somewhat liquid, a little bit on the safer end there. Again, another 3 to 5 years with basically going into retirement, starting off at about 5 years of cash flow needs. So that might be another, whether it be about $450,000 or so for this example, kind of do some real rough math there, and something safe. Now, again, we kind of know from what we were talking about earlier, going back here, that if we're using this money up first in those first couple of years, the next place that we're going to need to take money from is going to be traditional. Generally, the thinking and the philosophy is to let that Roth money grow as long as possible, getting some of the tax-free advantages of a Roth account. In fact, actually, when we do a Roth conversion, you remember we have the 5-year rule, so we have to wait 5 years until that money that we converted from a traditional to a Roth is actually available for us. But basically, our bucket two for our cash flow buffer is really going to be money that's going to be in the IRA account. And that's not a bad place for it anyway, because again, our Roth is going to be something that's going to get tax-free growth, and anything that's in the IRA account, if it grows, we're going to eventually have to pay taxes on that in the future there. So basically, we want to build that up inside the IRA account, and then everything else theoretically could be in growth. So once you've kind of covered bucket one, 2 years of cash flow liquid, another 3 to 5 years, starting off with 5 years. In bucket number two, that's going to be still some liquid and basically some things that are going to hopefully maybe pay some dividends or some interest that could help to replenish bucket number one. Then theoretically everything else could be in growth, but you're going to want to look at your own unique risk tolerance. Okay, so just because you covered bucket one and bucket two doesn't mean you should put all of the rest of that money in growth investments. You still want to do something that you're going to be able to sleep well at night. So that still may mean that you have some more conservative assets that are kind of in that growth category as well, because you don't want to see the kind of volatility that sometimes the financial markets can be known for. Okay, so that's it for this video. That is creating your retirement withdrawal plan. I know this video was a little bit longer. This tends to be one of the more popular topics here on the YouTube channel. So if you do like today's video, be sure to hit that like button there, subscribe to our channel. It's a great way to kind of get the video out there to a whole bunch of new people and new audiences. And really appreciate you sticking with me through this. We got into a lot of detail here. Hopefully that's going to be some useful information you're going to be able to use to put together your retirement withdrawal plans. And if you want to learn a little bit more about what we do at Money Evolution, we've got some links down in the description below. Our Wealth Vision Comprehensive Financial Plan, you can go to wealthvisionplan.com and you can be taken to a page basically where you can learn a little bit more about the financial planning process that we use. And if you're interested, if that sounds good on that page, you can put your name and information in to sign up for a free introductory call with me so we can see if it's something that might be right for you. And also too, we have our retirement planning course called the Retirement Time Machine. It's a little bit more of a DIY sort of a plan, but we get into a lot of this. We've got some really great worksheets in there that can really help you to make sense of all of these different retirement planning topics. So anyway, with that, enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you back in one of our next videos. Thanks.